Screams echo from an adjoining room as the soon-to-be notorious gangster Whitey Bulger looks into the eyes of a man he does not know is a CIA agent, an agent committing a crime that will forever shame the agency. Bulger, hallucinating madly, sees the man's skin melt from his face as he repeats slowly, "You work for us." Is this what made the young Bulger into a maniacal killer? Today, we'll lift the lid off this horrifying secret, but first let's have a look at the thousands of men who had prison testicle transplants. The San Quentin prison testicle experiments. In the 1920s, it was wrongly believed by some people that if a man was incapable of having children or achieving an erection, someone else's testicles could be transplanted onto his body to replace his removed testicles. If some older men had about $10,000, around $150,000 today, they could get a fresh pair of balls. We promise you, we aren't making this up. So, how do you test such operations? Chimpanzees? Actually, a paper we read said chimps were really expensive. You had to import them and look after them. Humans were way cheaper, and in prisons, people had no rights. The man for this job was San Quentin Chief Surgeon Leo Stanley. He was doing prison experiments in which he'd wait for a guy to be executed and then quickly whip off his balls. He could do this as he was the prison pathologist. He put the grapes on ice, and later he'd surgically attach them to another prisoner whose balls he already removed. He'd usually choose aged prisoners because he wanted to see if the old guy could get the young guy's spunk. Stanley was one of those people who viewed criminals as the scum of the earth, and that's why he didn't mind doing tests on them. In fact, many of his experiments consisted of attaching animal testicles to prisoners. This is how his mind worked. In his memoir, he wrote about a guy that forged a $5 check, an insignificant crime. Still, Stanley said, he was a typical prison malingerer, perfect specimen for any proponent of euthanasia or painless elimination of the socially unfit. Stanley said such men had a moral disease, which is why he felt it was fine to sterilize hundreds of them so when they did get out of prison they couldn't pass on their disease to their children. Not surprisingly, not many prisoners jumped at the chance of losing their testicles to have them replaced with some animal gonads, so Stanley put up a sign in the prison yard selling sterilization to the prisoners. It said, "This simple operation prevents the man from producing children, but it does not interfere with his normal pleasures. In fact, it is claimed that sexual vigor is increased." In one of the many similar cases, he took the balls off a corpse and surgically attached them to a 72-year-old prisoner. Stanley wrote that after the operation, the old guy was as lively as a young colt. The rhyme, liar, liar, pants on fire can have two meanings here, considering the pain men felt after the operation. Stanley still used the testicles from goats, boars, rams, and deer, which he then took to the aged prisoner whose scrotum was about to be emptied and refilled. He believed this gave the guy some extra testosterone. Despite what Stanley wrote at times, these old guys with new balls weren't suddenly running around like 15-year-old boys who discovered how to take the parental controls off their iPhones. So Stanley changed course, mashing the donor balls into a fine paste and injecting that into the poor fella's abdomen. Well, that didn't work either. Still, Stanley said while this guy might not be making babies again, he believed the mixture could cure depression and asthma. In 1922, the Los Angeles Times reported that Stanley implanted goat glands into 1,000 inmates over a period of weeks. The article explained that he took the goat glands and cut them into very small slices, after which he injected them into the prisoners' abdomens. Stanley wrote in his notes, one melancholic who would not talk or show any activity whatever was observed to have an erection a few days after implantation. News traveled about his experiments. In 1919, the United Press Dispatch wrote, "Youth is returning to the old man who received the life-giving gland from Tom Belton, the Merced murderer who was hanged last Friday." The prison physicians today stated that he had a better appetite and increased pulse. By the time Stanley retired, he'd performed about 10,000 testicular implants in the prison. Now, let's look at a case that has caused the U.S. government eternal embarrassment: the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In 1933, a doctor started typing up a medical article that would cause decades of shame for the USA. Today, you'll hear the word syphilis a few times, so it's best you know something about it. Before syphilis became easily treatable with antibiotics, it was one of the biggest killers in the world. The disease produced ugly sores and often made the victim look like something out of a horror movie. This bacterial infection would quite literally rearrange people's faces before it killed them. Since it was a sexually transmitted disease, it was very stigmatized. Sufferers became outcasts, pariahs, and it wasn't always easy to hide since people often lost their noses. In the 1700s in London, there was even a no-nose club where such monsters could drink booze in peace. Knowing little factoids like this makes it all the more disturbing when you hear that the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in their experiments chose not to treat this nose-eating, face-transforming stigmatized disease for around 600 African Americans between 1932 and 1972. That's right, they knowingly destroyed these men's lives in the name of science, of course. You also need to know that Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin in 1928. However, it didn't become the standard treatment for syphilis until 1947. Still, these men could have been treated during the many decades of the experiments, and prior to 1947, physicians did have some ways to treat the disease. The CDC and its partner knew they were killing people by not treating them, and worse, when these victims went to doctors who knew about the experiment, they were gaslit. They were never told what was wrong with them, instead being told their sickness was in their heads. In the 1920s, 36% of the 27,000 residents of Tuskegee in Macon County, Alabama, were infected with syphilis. This was the highest concentration of syphilis in the USA. Many of these people were black, with 82% of the town's residents being African American. These men weren't in prison, but they were viewed as prison prospects in this highly racist era. The reason they were used as guinea pigs was because their low education and the poverty they lived in. They were seen as expendable. One doctor who was part of the study wrote, "We must remember we're dealing with a group of people who are illiterate, have no conception of time, and whose personal history is always indefinite." We should also say that it wasn't only white folks conducting these studies, though race certainly mattered here. Many of the doctors and nurses involved were also African Americans. The Tuskegee Institute and the two main hospitals conducting the study were known as African American institutions, but it's thought many of the people involved didn't know these men wouldn't be treated, at least at some point in time. But if we're going to put the blame on one person, that would be the study founder, Mr. Taliaferro Clark, the head of public health, who had the full backing of the U.S. government. He was one of many top dogs in the study. They wanted to know if syphilis affected black folks in the same way it affected white folks. It was generally thought race mattered, and some said if left untreated, black people's bodies might be better at fighting syphilis. This wasn't true at all. They weren't told they had syphilis, but that they had bad blood. The men were then informed that if they kept going back to see the doctor, they'd get free lunches on every visit. Their medical care would be free, as would their transportation costs. Seemed like a good deal for their bad blood. They weren't treated at all, only given things that did nothing to help their condition, such as vitamins and tonics. They were also told that if their bad blood killed them, their families would get a $50 burial stipend. Also, besides the free stuff, at the end of the year they got a bonus of $25. When World War II came around, they also got out of the draft because the health authorities managed to convince the Macon County Draft Board not to take them. Over the years, some of these men became very ill. Eventually, over 100 of them died from the disease. Secretly, their autopsies were analyzed for what doctors considered important data. Just as shocking is the fact that since the guys didn't know they had syphilis, wives and girlfriends almost certainly got it in many cases. Since there's a thing called congenital syphilis, 19 children were needlessly born with syphilis. As one journalist wrote, the lives of these black men and many of their families were mostly ruined. If it hadn't been for a whistleblower, we might not have ever known about this highly unethical study. Just like many of the things we'll talk about today, the authorities would have always kept it a secret. A lawsuit in 1974 led to embarrassment and also a settlement of $10 million. The biggest payout to just one person was only $40,000. Most people got less than $20,000. This paltry sum after their life of eminently treatable pain in what was called an unethical, immoral, and racist study. We can say the same about this next case, Guatemala. In 1997, President Bill Clinton apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This man of exemplary moral character told the world the United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. Most Americans wondered how such a terrible experiment could have taken place, but we're glad this kind of thing was a one-off, right? In 2010, President Barack Obama was the next POTUS to issue an apology for horrific experiments conducted on people the U.S. government considered valueless. This time, the studies happened in the country of Guatemala between 1946 and 1948. Sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis, were still a huge problem in the U.S., especially where soldiers were concerned. During World War II, American servicemen traveled the globe and on their way picked up various diseases. It was estimated about 350,000 soldiers had STDs, which was costing the American government about $34 million a year. That's about $568 million in today's money. Penicillin was already known to cure syphilis, but its effectiveness was still being debated, and the U.S. wanted to know if it would work on any number of STDs. A surgeon named John Charles Cutler, who'd already worked at the Tuskegee study, then decided some test subjects were needed. Again, the poor were chosen. So he made a deal with some Guatemalan physicians and was soon told the U.S. had free reign in Guatemala prisons, mental hospitals, and, wait for it, orphanages. You'll see later that this wasn't actually that unusual. Using various methods, including an injection to the back of the skull, they gave 1,308 people STDs, including gonorrhea, cancroid, and syphilis. These Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, orphans, and psychiatric patients were aged 10 to 72. In some instances, female sex workers were infected through their cervixes and then told to go into these institutions and sleep with the men inside. It was quite common and legal then for prostitutes to enter prisons or army barracks. The U.S. physicians paid them for this. One of the doctors noted that it wasn't easy controlling the women. He wrote in a study paper, "Unfortunately, our female donor is leaving her profession for marriage and is no longer available." Cutler wrote that he was worried someone might blow the lid on the experiments, saying in one letter, "A few words to the wrong person here or even at home might wreck it or parts of it." In another letter, he had a different opinion on the experiment, saying, "I'm a bit, in fact more than a bit, leery of the experiment with the insane people. They cannot give consent, do not know what's going on, and if some goody organization got wind of the work, they would raise a lot of smoke." We know the truth about these experiments, though, through these letters and other documents discovered after Cutler's death in 2003. Other study notes were dug up, some of them quite shocking. One note featured a woman named Berta who got sick after seeing Dr. Cutler. The note reads, "On August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. 3 days later, Berta's eyes were full of pus, and she was bleeding internally. She then died. 83 people died in all during the experiments, but it's not clear what killed them in some of the cases. What is clear is that some people died in what was a government-sponsored murder. President Obama said it was a crime against humanity. Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, said she was outraged and that the experiments were reprehensible and abhorrent. Strong language, but it didn't affect what happened in the courts. These poor Guatemalans and their families got an apology, but unlike the patients in Tuskegee, they didn't receive any compensation. As you'll now see, doing such things on home turf can be costly. The Monster Study. The mastermind of the Monster Study was a psychologist named Wendell Johnson. His lifelong passion was studying speech, specifically people with stutters or stammers. One of the reasons was that he grew up with a stutter, by all accounts a severe one. He was as smart as a whip in school, becoming the class president and valedictorian, but he had that terrible stutter, something that affected him deeply. He wrote once, "I became a speech pathologist because I needed one." The problem with speech issues, especially back then, is they weren't very well understood. Even now, we don't know exactly why people stammer. There are many reasons, none of which Johnson understood decades ago. Johnson had an idea and enlisted his clinical psychology graduate students to help him. He told them that he thought children stuttered only because as kids they've been scolded for minor speech problems, which then became severe stutters. Once they'd been told they stuttered, they got nervous every time they spoke, and their stutter worsened. Ergo, Johnson said, people stutter because they're told they do. It's a matter of feeling under pressure. But how could he prove this? On January 17, 1939, he traveled to the Children's Orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, which, considering the conditions of the time, was just about as bad for a child as going to a prison for an adult. He traveled there with his assistant, Mary. Thanks to the Great Depression, orphans were aplenty. Johnson had about 600 of them to choose from, but he picked out 22. The task was simple. Mary took the 22 kids aside. Only 10 of them had obvious stutters. First, she took the 10 stutterers and told them to speak. Even though they stuttered, 5 of them in Group 1A were told, "You do not stutter, your speech is fine." The other 5 in Group 1B were told, "Yes, your speech is as bad as people say." This way, they could see if what they said affected the stutterer's speech. Things were worse for the 12 non-stutterers that were now left in Groups 2A and 2B. Johnson and Mary wanted to find out if you could actually make a kid who spoke fine stutter by destroying his or her sense of self-worth and telling them they had a speech impediment. Only 6 kids were in this group. The other 6 were complimented on their perfect speech. Now, you can only imagine how this messed up the kids that didn't stutter when they were told by doctors that they stuttered. Some were young as 5, and here were serious-looking adults in white lab coats telling them they couldn't speak right. These sessions went on for 6 months, too. It was okay for the stuttering kids in the other group. They just kept being told, "You'll outgrow the stuttering and you'll be able to speak much better than you're speaking now. Pay no attention to what others say about your speaking ability." Then, they'd go over to the kids who spoke fine and tell them the staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Do not ever speak unless you can do it right. The other researchers who were watching this took notes about what happened to the kids as the experiments went on. One of them wrote about a young girl who spoke fluently but was told the opposite. She wrote, "It was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before." Talking about a 9-year-old named Betty Romp, she wrote that she practically refuses to talk. One girl became much more conscious of herself and she talked less. When asked why she talked less, the girl replied, "Because I'm afraid I can't speak." She and others in her group stopped talking in class. Some could no longer do their homework. An 11-year-old boy said, "My words just won't come out. It feels like they're stuck in my head." They weren't stuttering, they just lost all their confidence. These kids thought they were going mad. They heard their words came out fine, but these adults were telling them a different story. Not only that, but they were friends with the stuttering kids and they heard them stutter, and those kids were being told they didn't stutter while they were being told the opposite. It made no sense, but then adults wouldn't just lie, right? Johnson and Mary, of course, thought they'd get all the stuttering kids not to stutter and the non-stuttering kids to stutter. Still, all they did was make the non-stuttering kids insecure about their speech, and they gave the stuttering kids some serious mental health problems. The kids were never told it was a game, not until later when Johnson realized he'd really screwed up their minds. What he couldn't know then is some of them would have trouble speaking for the rest of their lives. Other psychologists heard about the study and could not believe what they were hearing. That's why it's called the monster study. One of them later wrote, "It reminded people of the Nazi experiments on human subjects." The other professors at the time told him that it would ruin his reputation to publish the data. It was chilling and disturbing. Mary later admitted it was wrong. She said she regretted it all but put a lot of blame on Johnson because he hadn't gone back to the orphanage and done follow-up work. Those kids had been left alone with their negative thoughts. The public might not have heard anything about it if it wasn't for a journalist who published a story in 2001. In 2007, 7 of the victims were compensated to the tune of $1.2 million. All of them were in their 70s and 80s, and every one of them claimed to have lifelong psychological and emotional scars. Now for some brutal physical torture sponsored by your favorite American companies. The worst place in the world. One of the scariest things ever said by any human is this: "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Acres of skin. Sounds like something from a horror movie, something a brain-eating zombie or blood-sucking vampire would say. But these were the words of a scientist and human experimentation advocate named Albert Kligman. He was referring to the first time he walked into the Holmesburg prison, aka the Terrordrome. That day he saw hundreds of prisoners hanging around who he knew had zero rights, so he could do what he wanted to them. He was given free rein to experiment on those men, which was a total breach of their human rights, the Hippocratic Oath, and it has to be said, the Nuremberg Code. Kligman was certainly a piece of work. After watching a few prisoners mill around and speaking to some of them, he called them an idle collection of humanity. He was then given a bunch of cash, all greenlit by the US government, to test various chemicals on the prisoners. Some of the money came from the US Army, most of the cash came from Johnson & Johnson and Dow Chemicals. The prisoners didn't know what they were getting into when they accepted a payment to take part in what they were being told were harmless trials. They didn't know they were being tested with chemicals that would blister their skin. They weren't told about the radiation, the drugs that made them half mad, the compounds that caused cancer, and the injections that gave them herpes and staphylococcus. There are reports of prisoners who had their skin burned so badly it became like leather. One guy said they almost burned his testicles off. One of the female victims later said, "They used my body. They did things to me that were inhuman. I feel less than a woman because of the things they did to me. This brought me pain, a lot of pain." It sounds like horror, but of course all horror movies take their inspiration from somewhere. Did you ever watch Human Centipede? Well, one of the experiments in this prison was to sew parts of dead people onto the prisoner's body to see if the organs would grow back. We're not kidding you. Imagine walking around with a dead man's finger stitched to your back. In another experiment, they smeared prisoners' feet with fungi. The men had to keep special boots on for a week, which gave them ringworms. Dow Chemical paid Kligman a massive $10,000 for him to test the prisoners with a carcinogen found in Agent Orange. In small doses, it might not be too bad, but Dow told Kligman to rub 468 times more of this stuff on them than they thought to be safe. Johnson & Johnson had the doctor test a cream that blistered prisoners' skin and created ulcers that leaked white pus. One prisoner said that it felt like his whole body was on fire. The US Army had the doctor test chemical warfare agents on the guys with substances that were said to be acutely toxic, incapacitating agents. Others were tested with scopolamine, aka the devil's breath, a mind-altering substance so powerful it said it can turn people into something like a zombie. It's been used in the past for witchcraft purposes and trippy magic ceremonies, and in Colombia for robberies, kidnapping, and assault. One guy named Joseph Smith later testified about the experiments in court. The doctors told him they were going to attach some gauze to him and that it was absolutely safe. They worked on his back a bit and applied the gauze. That caused a lot of pain, said Smith in court. At night, I would lay in my bed with my arm in the air, shaking it so it would ease the pain. He said some of the prisoners couldn't tolerate the pain, so they took off the patches, they stuck them to the wall, and they melted the paint. In another experiment, Smith got 3 injections every few hours for 3 months. It was a lot of effort, but he got $2 for every shot, which was serious money in the prison bank back in the 1960s. But every time he got the shots, the body part where the shot was administered to would expand. They never told him what they were injecting him with. Smith said the third experiment I was involved with was the Army LSD test. He wasn't told what it was. He said that he kind of blacked out. I don't remember eating during that time, he said. I know I wasn't right in my head. Like all the prisoners, Smith thought they were good guys because they wore lab coats. No one thought that doctors would deliberately hurt them. In 1969, while free, Smith's skin was discolored. Then his teeth fell out, like in a bad dream. He found he couldn't talk to people anymore. His mind had been fried. His eyesight went, which he now knows was because of the experiments they did with his eyes. Smith was the reason why some of the creams you now buy say, "Keep away from your eyes. Wash immediately if contact is made." Smith's mother took him to see a psychiatrist and he was diagnosed with schizophrenic schizoid characteristics. That was the LSD, which you'll hear more about soon. The final words for his testimony are, they should not have done what they did. From 1951 to 1974, under the sponsorship of those huge mega companies, thousands of prisoners became human guinea pigs. The prison was a huge lab. One of the guys that uncovered it walked in there in 1971, and at first he didn't know why the place looked so strange. He later said, "What I saw was scores of inmates whose bodies were covered with medical tape and bandages. I could see them on their arms, chests, shoulders, and back. It looked like there'd been a major gang war or a knife fight in the exercise yard or cell block." The prisoners told him that the money was too good to turn down. For a full day's work, they got maybe 50 cents, but letting doctors test stuff on them was sometimes worth hundreds of dollars over months. On top of that, they were told that doing the experiments would certainly help their cause when their parole hearing came around. No one got compensation, even though it was heard in court that these experiments were just as bad, if not worse than Tuskegee. It was said that Kligman had turned Holmesburg into the Kmart of human experimentation. Cow's blood. The Alliance for Human Research Protection explains that in 1942, a Harvard biochemist named Edward Cohn, working for the U.S. Navy, injected men with cow's blood. It said he injected 64 Massachusetts prisoners with cow blood during research on blood transfusions. He apparently did a lot of good work in this area, which was direly needed for the military since soldiers sometimes need transfusions after being injured in battle. Still, after his test with those men, he wrote, "The rejection of the blood was catastrophic. All the men died." That's one way of putting it. Another paper written about the experiment doesn't even mention death. It just says, "Unfortunately, the residual differences between cow and human blood proteins proved insurmountable, dooming the medical utility of the bovine protein for the casualties of war." These next prisoners didn't die, but man, they suffered in the name of science. Dr. Carl G. Heller. The big threat during the Cold War was nuclear weaponry and what high doses of radiation did to the body. That's why in the 1970s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission gave Dr. Carl G. Heller and Dr. C. Alvin $1.6 million. They said, let's see what radiation does to the male reproductive system. In the experiments, each prisoner was paid $5 for an initial blast of radiation, another $10 for each biopsy, usually 5 biopsies, and $100 when it was all over. The prisoners were told to lie face down with their scrotums in a little box filled with warm water. The box was connected to a set of X-ray tubes, and then came the blast. This all happened to prisoners in 1970 in Washington and 1973 in Oregon. But there were ethical problems. The guys weren't told anything in their informed consent forms about radiation poisoning. They weren't informed about the high chance that they'd get cancer. They just thought a couple of $100 for dangling your balls in a small pool of warm water was easy compared to the 25 cents a day they were getting in prison. About the missing details, Dr. Heller later said, "I didn't warn them of all the dangers because I didn't want to frighten them." What he did tell them, though, is that the whole point of the experiment was to sterilize them. He said they'd get all that money and a reduction in their sentence if they agreed to not be able to have any more kids. He said such kids would be radiation-induced mutants. Actually, out of the 650 or so prisoners that took the heavy dose, some went on to have children with serious birth defects. In April of 2001, a settlement was made for $1.5 million, which worked out to about $30,000 for every guy that had gotten their balls fried in Oregon. The guys in the Washington prison received $2.4 million in March 2000. This worked out at $100,000 to $150,000 per prisoner that was still living. Okay, now let's talk about something literally mind-blowing. MK Ultra. Now we come to what we consider to be the most fascinating story of them all. The CIA's LSD mind control and psychological torture experiments, aka MK Ultra. These stories are not just important when it comes to human rights and official secrecy, but they affected cultures all over the world in a very profound way. The CIA didn't know it at the time, but it changed history. Ironically, if it hadn't been for MK Ultra, the Beatles would arguably never have grown their hair long and written all their best songs. In the USA, there'd be no Merry Pranksters, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, or no epoch-making concert in a field in Woodstock. LSD changed everything. One of the main reasons is people such as Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, were part of the experiments and took LSD out of the labs and into the streets, helping to create a cultural revolution that became a living nightmare for the CIA and the government in general. The CIA had vastly misunderstood LSD's psychedelic ability to open the mind, what Aldous Huxley called opening the doors of perception. The problem is when such drugs are given to you in huge doses and you don't know what they are, you think you lost your mind. These experiments went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973, and encompassed a myriad of unbelievable experiments. We imagine not many of you have heard of MK Ultra's Operation Midnight Climax, in which the CIA paid prostitutes to lure customers back to CIA safe houses where the men were plied with LSD and other substances and then fed subliminal messages as the women asked them questions designed by the CIA. Agents would record all of this and then watch the sessions through one-way glass. The CIA even spiked government employees and their own biological warfare scientists, one of them named Frank Olson, who mysteriously flew out of the 10th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York in 1953. Before that, Olson had seen the CIA do some very disturbing things to prisoners, and he didn't like what he saw. The death could well have been a murder. It happened only 10 days after the CIA agents had spiked his drink with what they considered a potential truth serum. He was one of few people that knew about the project, and just before he died, he had said to his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." Olson was said to have been sensitive, not a characteristic you need when working for the sometimes psychopathic CIA. A report unearthed said this: Olson witnessed horrific, brutal interrogations on a regular basis. Detainees who were deemed expendable, suspected spies or moles, security leaks, etc., were literally interrogated to death in experimental methods combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture to attempt to master brainwashing techniques and memory erasing. The CIA thought he was going to pull the plug. Olson's colleague later said Frank Olson pulled no punches anytime. That's what they were scared of, I'm sure. Did they kill one of their own? Now we know a report was written about Olson and handed to CIA operatives after he'd seen horrific experiments in Germany. The report stated, Olson visited a CIA safe house near Stuttgart where he saw men dying, often in agony, from the weapons he had made. He was deeply disturbed over what he had seen in the CIA safe houses in Germany and displayed symptoms of not wanting to keep secret what he had witnessed. Not long after that, LSD was slipped into his drink and he ended up dead on a sidewalk. After investigating the case, a U.S. lawyer wrote, Frank Olson did not die because he was an experimental guinea pig who experienced a bad trip. He died because of concern that he would divulge information concerning a highly classified CIA interrogation program. A New York assistant district attorney said there was motive to kill him. He knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War. If they do that to their own people, what would they do to people they thought were scum? Soon, CIA agents were in prisons all over the U.S. telling prisoners to take a drink of their truth serum. They told the gangster Whitey Bulger that they were working on a way to cure schizophrenia. They gave him massive doses, which he later said made him think he had gone insane. Remember, at this point, not many people knew what LSD was. It was way before the hippies came on the scene. Bulger later said, I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me. He explained how things went down. I was in a cell and they brought in a doctor. He had a syringe and said, this is a new drug. We want to try it out on you. They shot me up with it and I was tripping for 2 days. It was a mind blower. He got 50 separate doses. He was still young at the time and not the violent man he would become. It was later said he didn't murder prior to LSD. His brain may have been altered. So how could you say he was really guilty? The CIA tried their hardest to destroy all documents about MKUltra, but they failed. People asked how this could happen in a democratic nation. In court, it was heard that Americans all over the mainland were probably walking around with severe physical and psychological damage thanks to the CIA. Admiral Stansfield Turner, who became the director of Central Intelligence, said at a hearing in 1977 that some of these prisoners were not given a choice. Turner said, "We also know that some unwitting testing took place on criminal sexual psychopaths confined at a state hospital. In 1956, they gave people a drug named bulbocapnine, something which kills cattle. Humans were given what the document said was fairly large doses, which led to catatonia or stupor. Documents showed the CIA wanted to evaluate the drug on convicts incarcerated at the deleted state penitentiary to see if they could make someone lose their memory or willpower. Other documents say under Operation Artichoke, part of MKUltra, they gave an imprisoned Soviet agent sodium pentothal, now part of lethal injections, and disoxin, speed, which they say blitzed the guy's mind, and an agent was able to convince him he was a trusted and beloved friend. They could have just given him MDMA and he'd have hugged his new friends too." All jokes aside, these were physically and psychologically dangerous experiments. A man named Harold Blower, who was given large doses of LSD at a New York State Psychiatric Institute in 1953, died right after he'd been injected with the drug. His last words were, "I don't feel so good. Something's wrong." LSD can't really kill you, but the shock can. His heart failed. The New York Times said that this man had reacted badly the first few times they dosed him, but they still kept going. In CIA reports, they actually called guys like this expendables. All this time, the CIA was trying to find out if they could wipe someone's mind and turn them into a robot agent. Let's remember that some people think Charles Manson was part of these experiments and he was under mind control, or the killers he sent to murder those people were. The well-reviewed book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s makes this scenario look very plausible. You might also not know that the Unabomber serial killer Ted Kaczynski was part of these experiments and was never the same after them. Then there were the experiments in Canada sponsored by the CIA through one of its many fronts. These experiments, according to one victim, stripped your soul. The CIA paid a wad of cash to the Canadian psychiatrist Donald Cameron. With CIA funding, he was able to take his research to a new level. He believed that people with mental health issues such as depression and anxiety could be reprogrammed, their minds wiped clean and then filled again with new thoughts. Of course, the CIA loved the sound of that. So they gave Cameron money and resources. Cameron took patients, often women with only minor depression, and gave them electroconvulsive therapy along with massive doses of LSD. He'd often keep them in a coma in what he called psychic driving experiments, playing their comatose minds the same recorded words over and over again, 24 hours a day for weeks on end, sometimes months. One former patient later explained the horrifying ordeal. She said, "He couldn't get his patients to listen to them enough, so he put speakers in football helmets and locked them on their heads. They were going crazy, banging their heads into walls, so he then figured he could put them in a drug-induced coma and play the tapes as long as he needed." One patient said she was kept in a coma for 18 days and the second time for 29 days. As soon as she woke up, he fried her brain with electric shocks, way more powerful than is standard in electroconvulsive therapy. As she was in a state of utter fear and confusion, he made her take LSD and other drugs. The woman's daughter said her mother was never the same when she came out of that hospital. She told the media, "They say it was torture for human beings, human torture. What they attempt to do is erase your emotions." Cameron believed, like Dr. Frankenstein, that he could make new people, what he called super citizens, and that was something the CIA wanted to get involved with. Cameron was convinced he could de-pattern the human mind, and from something damaged or broken, he could create something new. For that, the CIA made him a wealthy doctor. He got about $600,000 in today's money. The sad thing was, he is never punished for this. The CIA was never punished for 20 years of utter barbarity we would usually associate with Nazi Germany. As we've seen, the only people who ever get properly punished are the folks that leak such secrets and are called a threat to national security. The worrying question is, what experiments might be happening right now? Psychological warfare units still receive huge budgets. The CIA is just as secretive. Maybe you'll find out that one day you were part of the madness. Now you need to watch the full sleep room video inside CIA's terrifying sleep room, or listen to more about Mr. Manson and how they caught Charles Manson.